ask you a bit about the First Nations Education Act, and it's recently been tabled, as I understand. But a more general question, Canada is often seen as a haven for minorities and, you know, a very wonderful country, but when can that sometimes not be the case?
Well, I think mainly for the people who were here first. So, you know, I think that what we have seen is terrible statistics on whether it's suicide or TB, but particularly on education. So the reason why I think National Chief Atleo had really focused on education for his term of office was that it seems to be evidence-based way of doing better for his people. So that is the key, that when only a third of First Nations students are finishing high school, we know that that's terrible in terms of health outcomes, education outcomes obviously, but particularly economic outcomes. And so that for us to, you know, during the Kelowna Accord, Paul Martin was able to put money into education, but with a 10-year plan, that within 10 years, Indigenous students would finish high school at the same rate as Canadians, as the Canadian average. And so it's, you know, really sad that almost 10 years later, we've still only got a third of First Nations students finishing high school. The ones who are finishing are doing really well and going on to masters and PhDs and doctors in engineering and lawyers and all those, and entrepreneurs. But, you know, still, it's way too many who don't finish, and we know that the less education that you have, the more likely you are to end up in trouble and health, with the law, with all, you know, economically. It's really important that we get this right. The First Nations Education Act was just universally, you know, rejected. Now the new iteration, the First Nations Control over First Nations Education Act, we are concerned that they may have technically met the 5 criteria that the Assembly of First Nations put in their motion at their meeting in December. But I think that there's obviously a huge breakdown of trust as to how this would work, and of course we're very upset that the money to actually fix this really doesn't flow till next year or the next year. So one of the things that we've been really fighting hard about was that the investment per student per year in children and youth on reserve is a half to 2/3 that of the provincial territorial systems. So that if, say, it's around $7,000 per student per year if the student is at a First Nations school, but $11,000, $12,000 if the student is in a provincial or territorial school. So we've been fighting for a long time with Paul Martin's educational initiative, all of these things, to try and close that gap, such that we have got to be investing in those students, such that the school they live in, you know, they go to school in, the teachers, the quality of teachers aren't just turning, you know, lower, or that they keep rotating. That there's just so much to do in order to make sure that these kids can be successful, because they've got the same investment and the same, therefore, opportunity as other Canadian kids. With First Nations, Inuit and Métis, the other thing that's hugely important is language and culture. That to not feel proud of who you are, to not know your history and your rights and all of those things, means that for generations there's been this shame that came out of residential schools. And for us now to understand that the kids that are doing really well are the ones who have been able to be back in touch with their languages, the ceremonies and elders, and be able to really be proud of the heritage that really has made Canada what it is in terms of environmental thinking 7 generations out, a pedagogy of learning by doing, the medicine wheel instead of the medical model that asks people to stay as healthy as they can be physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Elders instead of elderly, but also a sort of leadership which is asking, not telling. So First Peoples had a whole bunch of these things right before the settlers arrived. And so it's really important that in any education system designed for First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, that the First Nations, Inuit, Métis have control over that, so that the education is relevant and responsive to the needs. And it means that also the First Nations, Inuit, Métis kids in urban schools also need to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. And that's why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been very strong about how important it is that the curricula for all Canadians get changed, such that it's what I call idle no more, that you can actually have the 96% of Canadians not from an Indigenous background understand what the shared history and problems from the Indian Act to residential schools, that all of us need to be pulling hard for better public policy.